Go.
If you have your Bibles this morning, open to the Gospel of Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. So we're going to finish up our Sabbath day stuff that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. And I'm not going to rehash a lot of what I did in Bible study Wednesday night. So in Bible study, we went into really great detail about what the Sabbath was and what it is. And so I'm going to sum it up quickly because I want us to understand it. See, my fear is that we made the Sabbath into some legalistic observation that, depending on how you were raised and where you went to church, you've got different ideas and understandings of the Sabbath. And so we want to kind of get the real perspective on what the Sabbath is. What we don't want to do is we don't want to make it a day in which we do or don't do certain things. And that's what we have a tendency to do. And it becomes really a legalistic understanding of what the Sabbath is. We want to really get the truth of what Jesus meant, because Jesus clarifies our understanding of the Sabbath in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, when I was doing my study on this, it seems to me like of all the 10 Commandments, the one that is really elaborated on and clarified in the New Testament is the commandment to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So we want to do that, and we want to do that within the framework of how Jesus interpreted it, which is in Mark chapter 2. So there are multiple instances where Jesus is accused of violating the Sabbath. And one comes, I believe, from Mark 2. And maybe it's not Mark 2, I can't remember. I think it was, though. It's when Jesus' disciples were going through the cornfield, and they're plucking the ears of corn and eating them, or grain. And so when the Pharisees come to Jesus, they ask the question, why are your followers violating the Sabbath day? And why are they doing what's not lawful? And Jesus makes a couple statements there. One is the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so when we talked about rest last week, hope you understand that's in the context of God has given you a day to rest. He didn't make you to fit into a day. So the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And number two is Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. So he is the one who alone has the ability to reinterpret for us what we understand the Sabbath to be. And we're going to do that from Luke chapter 4. So we're going to start in verse 14, and we're going to read through verse 20, because there's a lot of stuff in there we really want to bear out. In particular, there's really one statement that Luke makes. And Luke does for us what a lot of times the writers of the Gospels don't do. He really tells us what Jesus said. So, verse 14 says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone was praising him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and the recovery of sight of the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So we know a couple of really important things about what Jesus does in Luke chapter 4. One is that he reads from a particular section of the book of Isaiah. Now, if my understanding is correct, that comes from Isaiah chapter 61, and it comes from Isaiah chapter 68. So we know a portion of what he's speaking about, and again, it's just a portion. But everything I read, and I couldn't find this, but everything I read seems to indicate that Jesus is reading a section of Isaiah that is elaborating on the Sabbath and the year of Jubilee. So let me just back up here for a second and kind of bring you up to where we were at last week. So everything we understand about the Sabbath is not just a day. So the Sabbath is more than a day. It actually is an understanding, or as Christians, for us, it's a concept. You see, the Sabbath is about living what we believe about the providence and the power of God. See, what we believe about God is that God is our provider, and everything we have comes from his hand. So if I'm trusting God every day of my life to our job, we're tied to our jobs in an unhealthy way. And I'm like Mandy. I don't get up in the morning and say, I love what I do. I want to do this 30 more years. I don't get up and say that. Let me tell you how I get up and start my day. Man, I got to pay my bills, so I'm going to work, and I'm going to do it for a few more years so then I can retire. I mean, that's kind of the way I start my day. That's the motivation I need to get through the day. That's why I'm in public employment. I could have done lots of other things, but I couldn't have done lots of other things that let me retire at 54 years old. So that's kind of my concept. So I don't love my job. I'm not tied to it. I go to work, and so I think we fall into this grind where like, I got to go to work because I got to pay my bills. And do I have to just pay my bills so I can live? No. I got to pay the iPhone bill for 4 iPhones so my kids can have the latest and greatest technology. I got to have streaming services. So the bills I pay, it's not like I'm killing myself to pay my water bill and my food bill. I'm killing myself to pay for all the pleasures that life affords me. That's the culture we live in. And so it's within that culture that we can understand Jesus says, don't worry about what you're going to eat. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. Don't worry about where you're going to live. See, all of those things are what the Gentiles seek after, but not with you. Don't worry about that because God, your Father above, He knows what you need before you even ask. And if He clothes the flowers of the field, and if he cares for the sparrows of the sky, how much more is He going to care for you and provide for you who are the highest of His creation? So we understand God provides for us in a way that no one else can. And He gives us provision that the world can't do. And if we really understand that, we don't have to worry about being legalistic about our understanding of the Sabbath because we can embrace it in a real way every day of our lives. But we don't, and we live in a culture that doesn't do that. So we're ingrained with this idea that I've got to make a lot of money and that I've got to make it fast if I really want to enjoy my life. And that's what our culture says to us. And that is so out of step with how we ought to live as Christians. Okay? So Luke chapter 4. Did I read Luke chapter 4 yet? Okay, I did. Okay, so we got that. So Jesus is not really beginning His ministry at this point. Even though it's early in Luke, this is not the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We know Jesus had previously been preaching in other places, and He'd been performing miracles in other places. This is just kind of the first time He's going to His hometown, and it's in His hometown where He really starts to define what His ministry is about. And so what I want to do is, there are a couple things that I think are important that we understand about what Jesus says, because if the context is correct, and I believe we have the context correct, and I even texted Phil a couple weeks ago. So the context that people say Isaiah speaks of is the year of Jubilee. Okay? And the year of Jubilee, I don't think we talked about it on Sunday, but we talked about it on Wednesday. That was this 50th year in the Hebrew calendar in which there were some really cool things that happened. Okay? So a couple of things that came out of the year of Jubilee, which was an extension of the Sabbath. There are two important ones I want to talk about. It was called the year of the Lord's release. I like that word better. And so when we talked last week about the Sabbath as a rest, this week we're going to talk about the Sabbath as a release, because this is an important concept for us to get. So two things come out of the year of the Lord's release. They're both found in Deuteronomy 15, by the way. If you want to look them up, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can find them there. And so I reduced them to this. One was the release of all debt. Anybody who had any debt, that debt was alleviated. So if you borrowed money from a friend in the Sabbath year and in the year of Jubilee, all that debt was eliminated. Number two, it was the release of all servants and slaves. So anybody who was a slave, anybody who was a servant, see, it was common that day that if you couldn't pay your debts, and I said this last week, that you would sell yourself into servitude, and therefore you would become a slave to somebody. But in the Sabbath year and in the year of Jubilee, all of that was undone. Anybody who had been enslaved, anybody who had been indentured as a servant, they were all set free. So it was the year of the Lord's release. So those are two great concepts that come out of that. Anybody who had a debt, and let's just say it that way, anybody who had a debt of any kind, that debt was released. Now, there is also, in Deuteronomy 15, a warning that I think we need to take to heart, and I'm going to read it from the Amplified Version, because, see, it's dangerous for us to ignore some of these concepts and dismiss them as, oh, well, that's Old Testament, I don't need that. So this is the warning from Deuteronomy 15 about ignoring the law of the Sabbath. And this is what it says. Beware that there is no wicked thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release, is approaching, and your eye is unsympathetic towards your poor brother, and you give him nothing, since he would not be able to repay you. So here's what apparently God sees happening in this maybe the fifth and sixth year. Because if in the seventh year all debt and all obligations are released, see, God believed that evidently people would say, it's the sixth year or it's the fifth year. If I loan Mitch money, he doesn't have to pay it back in the seventh year. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm not going to loan Mitch money because I want to get paid back. So there is a warning in verse 9 of Deuteronomy 15 that says, don't take the attitude that I'm not going to help out my brother in need because I won't get paid back. And look, isn't that exactly something we would come up with in American culture today? Man, I can see lots of people say, well, I really want to help my brother out, but he's not going to be able to pay me back, so I'm not going to help him out. And so we're going to give with a very ungrateful and ungiving heart. And that's what God says, don't do that. When you give generously. As a matter of fact, when we read Deuteronomy 15, we actually find that it says this, and I'm kind of breaking it down. It says, so when your servant comes to the end of his service, in the seventh year, you're to set him free. But you just don't set him free. No, it actually says, don't send him away empty-handed. God says you're going to give to him liberally. So when your servant has done his obligation, you don't send him away and say, hey, good luck, brother, you're on your own now. You fill his coffers or his larder. Does anybody know what a larder is? Okay, cupboard, how about that? You fill his cupboard with stocks so that when he goes away full. Now see, that undermines everything we understand about how we help out the people around us. You see, we think, well, we'll help out the people around us if we've got a little bit extra to spare. We'll help out the people around us if we're going to get something out of it. We'll help out the people around us. That's why, look, there was a practice that has gone on in churches probably from as far back as what I can remember. And so we have these people come to us on occasion and say, I'd really like to help so-and-so out, but I want it to be anonymous. So if I write the church a check, can you give it to them on my behalf? Danny, what's our answer to that always? No. No, we don't pass, look, the government has this word. Look, so when you write a check to the church, you know what you do with your checks at the end of the year? Your tithes? What do you do with them? What most people do with them? You claim on your income taxes, right? Okay, so if you write a check to the church, let's say I want to give my wife $500 because she's got a need. She actually needs to buy a new TV. So I come to Danny and I say, hey, I want to make an anonymous contribution to someone in need. I'm going to write you a check for $500, and I want you to, on behalf of the church, I want you to give her $500. You know what the federal government calls that? Money laundering, yes. In the church, you know what we call it? A love offering. Isn't that weird? But that's the way we do it. So we have historically not done that at Buchanan, and we've had people say, hey, I want to make a gift to so-and-so. And so here's always my response. If you want to make a gift to so-and-so, bring me an envelope of cash, and we'll gladly take your cash. But we're not going to take a check, and that's the way I've always done it. And you know how many people have actually brought me cash to give to someone? Zero that I can think of. Because, unfortunately, we want some advantage when it comes to helping out a brother in need, don't we? That's just the reality of it. And that's a product of the culture that we live in. And so we need to be careful that we're not in it for the wrong reason, because we know the Lord loves what kind of giver? A cheerful giver. God doesn't love the kind of giver who's looking out for themselves. And so, look, when there's a warning in the Bible that says, be careful that your attitude about giving shouldn't be this, we need to be careful with that. And those are all part of the Sabbath laws that we should be living out every day in our lives, okay? So we got to get that concept first as it relates to this concept of the Sabbath as release. So one of the things we find out that Jesus is actually preaching, okay? He's actually preaching. If we're looking at this right, hold on, got my iPad all messed up, but I'll be back in just a second. There it is. So he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the captives, or in my NIV, it's prisoners. He has sent me to preach or to proclaim the recovery of sight for the blind, to set free the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, I want you to think about some of the things that have happened in our culture just in the last 2.5 months. And this is what I know firsthand. I actually got a letter in the mail from a credit card company, and they said, hey, guess what? You can skip your credit card payment this month, and we're not going to charge you any interest. Anybody hear anything like that or see anything like that? This is what I've noticed over the last couple of months in our culture, that banks now are at a point where they are either forgiving interest or they're forgiving loans. I'm guessing that's unprecedented in the history of our country, where we let that go. I've heard of landlords and people who have renters. They're actually saying to their tenants, you know what? You don't have to pay rent this month. We're giving you a month or 2 months free. I'm not in the landlord business, but I would guess that would be a pretty big deal if you're in the rent business. You're giving people a free place to live. I don't know that we've ever done that before in our country. And one of the things that I can't get my mind around. I just can't get my mind around this. In what I think is unprecedented. Back in April, the governor of the state of Ohio issued an order in which some people who are in prison are being set free. Now, have any of you ever seen in your life where the governor just says, you know what, we're going to empty out some of the prisons? Look, that's unprecedented for me. But yet what I know as I see all of that is it lines up to some extent with what God says should happen in a culture that holds Him as God. There should be a time in which prisoners are set free. As a matter of fact, Jesus says that His proclamation to set prisoners free, when He gets to the end in verse 21, He says, this is now fulfilled in your eyes. You're seeing it happen. So what we're seeing, even though we don't understand it, what we're seeing are the application of the principles of the year of Jubilee and the Sabbath year and the Sabbath day all rolled together being applied in our culture. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's kind of nice. And look, I'm just telling you, we live in a culture, I said last week, we live in a culture where we use people till they can't be used anymore. That's what we do in America. We work people till they can't be worked anymore, and when we're done, we throw them away. We as Americans, we are tied to our jobs in an unhealthy way, and we give ourselves to work for really nothing in return, and all of our lives are spent in the pursuit of prosperity. And we don't have time for anything that's really important in life. And, you know, I don't like the coronavirus, don't like the pandemic, don't like anything that it's caused. But what I see are good things that are happening in the middle of it. Look, for me, I've always said social distancing is a way of life for me. I'm really okay with that. I mean, and I don't think I've been to Walmart since this all started, but going to Walmart and avoiding everybody by at least 6 feet, I practiced that my whole life. That's normal for me. Being at home, hanging out with my family, I enjoy being with my family, so I got no problems with that. So I like some of what's going on. And I'll be honest with you, when I look at the greed that exists in our culture, and look, you know, I hear this all the time, and people ask and say, well, we're not really greedy, we're not really an oppressive culture. Yeah, we are in America. We're an oppressive culture. See, we don't like to think about that. We don't like to talk about that, especially here in our little pocket of Appalachia, where we're comfortable with the way we live, we're comfortable with what we believe. You know, we look around our culture and say, I don't see any problems with that, I'm just getting by. We live in an oppressive culture, where we see it every day. We don't want to talk about it. Most of us here in Buchanan, we come from middle-class backgrounds where we have comfortable lives and we live in a way that's comfortable for us. And so we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to question the system. We're happy with the way things are. Even though we look around and see poverty, we don't do a whole lot about it. Even though we look around and we see injustice, we don't do a whole lot about it. We stay quiet, and yet we know that we live in a culture where oppression exists every day. The rich oppress the poor on a regular basis in America, and we say nothing about it. We're happy to get our share of the pie, and we don't want to do anything to interfere with that. Look, I'll be honest with you. Growing up in Pike County, Because I've lived here like 98% of my whole life. I've only been away for a few years. I've grown up in a county where I've learned to be jaded about poverty. Maybe some of you have too. I've grown up in a culture where we would talk about, and I don't know what it's called now. When I was younger, it was called welfare. I don't know what it's called now. Government assistance of some kind. See, I grew up in a culture where we would talk about welfare, and we saw it within the context of second and third generation of dependent people. See, I grew up in a culture where that was the normal talk for us. We would talk about people who were dependent on the system, and they had been for generations. And so we always saw this idea that there's generational poverty, and we were okay with it. We would look at people who were locked into a government system of dependence, and we would continue to feed their dependence. And we would never think, should we help them break out of poverty? We never thought that. It never crossed our minds. We were good with the status quo, and we're still good with it today. And even though we talk about the problems that exist in our culture, I mean, look, when I look at my community, I see lots of problems. And I think we're getting far too comfortable with the problems that exist in our communities. We know we live in a culture. Look, in Appalachia, we've got an opioid problem, and we know that, but do we ever do anything about it? No. We maybe carry what's that stuff called? Narcan. As a matter of fact, we were in Bainbridge yesterday for Hannah's wedding, and as I was leaving Bainbridge, there's this great big sign. Did anybody else see that? That said, carry Narcan. That's what it said. Carry Narcan. Every life, or something like that. Make things. So we live in this culture where we know we've got problems, and we do nothing to address the problems. We're just content to go with the status quo. You see, that undermines the whole concept of what the Sabbath was supposed to be. The Sabbath was supposed to be a time of extending your hand to a needy brother. Matter of fact, it was about not being tight-fisted. God says, open your hand liberally. And yet we live in a culture where we're doing exactly what God says I don't want you to do, because we really don't get what Jesus meant when he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and the recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. See, we're living in a time when we are living in the year of the Lord's favor. He has blessed us in ways that are unspeakable. And many of us here this morning live lives that are very good lives, very comfortable lives. And when we understand that everything we've got is because God has been good to us, do we then share that goodness with the people around us? And sadly, for many of us, the answer is going to be no. We have much, and so you know what we do with much? We consume much. And remember when James says the reason the people ask what they don't get? See, in James deals with this problem evidently that was going on in the church. He says, well, there's a reason you don't have what you're asking for. Because when you ask with the wrong motive. What is the wrong motive they were asking with? They were asking with the motive they wanted so they could consume it in their own greed. And that kind of sets a good picture of where we're at in American culture today. We have a lot because we want a lot, and we use a lot because we have a lot that we can get, and we need to be careful. Look, I don't know that, I would condemn people for wealth. I don't know that I would condemn people for being blessed or having a lot, but be careful with what God is giving you, because you've been entrusted as a steward, not with what's yours, but what has been lent to you by God. See, the whole concept tied up in the Sabbath is that you don't really own anything or have anything. Everything you've got, God has given to you, and in 7 years it's going to be given back. That was the whole concept behind what God did in the Sabbath. It wasn't yours, it was lent to you, and someday it's going to go back. And so we just need to be careful of that, and we need to think about it. And so in our culture, as banks are kind of looking the other way when it comes to some loans, and as landlords are forgiving rent, and as prisoners are being set free, maybe, just maybe, God's trying to get us to understand how important it is we understand what he had to say about his Sabbath principles. But I don't know that we're fully going to get it, because we're just kind of locked into this idea that, well, hey, I go to church on Sunday, I do some spiritual things on Sunday, so don't hassle me. I'm doing everything I need to do with my Sabbath. when in reality you miss the whole concept of what God wants to do. And we're really kind of like the Pharisees of Luke 13. See, as I said before, there were multiple events in which Jesus would get into issues about the Sabbath day. And again, I want to clarify for everybody listening, look, the Sabbath day, what day of the week is that? Saturday. So the true Sabbath day is Saturday. As Christians, we don't observe the Sabbath day per se. We observe what we call the Christian Sabbath, and that's our Sunday. And I'm okay with that. I'm not hung up on that. But let's don't do what they did in Israel and make it some legalistic observation where you just got to go through the motions to please God. Because God doesn't want that. God wants you to serve Him every day of your life and embrace these principles. And so we get like these Pharisees in Luke chapter 13. And in Luke chapter 13, Jesus is in the synagogue. So turn there if you will, because I really want you to see this. This is important, I think, that we understand what's going on in this day and age. So Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and there's this woman who comes in and she's crippled. This is in verse 10. On a Sabbath day, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman who had been there crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, He called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then He put His hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Is that not awesome? Look, when you read that, this woman has been with this infirmity. As a matter of fact, the King James says she has a spirit of infirmity. And Jesus clarifies that this was actually some kind of demonic possession. And she'd been bound up by Satan for 18 years. So here's this woman who comes in on the Sabbath day and she gets healed. Wouldn't you just imagine that place would have broke out and shouting? I mean, I would think that. Imagine if someone came in here this morning and said, "Hey, Brian, you got a terminal disease. I want you to pray for me." And I said, how good would this be for TV and Facebook? If I said, "You know what? Your faith has healed you. Straighten up," and they were healed. Would that be awesome? That'd go viral. That's the word for it, right? We'd be viral and everybody'd be watching it. And then next week we'd have all these sick people coming in to get healed. And thus begins the TV ministry of Bishop Brian Burkheim. And so, you would think everybody'd be shouting, everybody'd be excited, because isn't that what we would do? Man, look, this place would be on fire if someone got healed like that. And so, everybody's standing around, and are they happy that she got healed? No, you know what? The NIV uses the word indignant. I don't know what that means exactly, except I think it means to be really mad about something. And so when the religious leaders see this woman who's been healed, they're not rejoicing. They're indignant. They're mad. And this is what they say. Now get your mind around this attitude, because our attitude's not that much different today. The attitude is, you know what? There are 6 days in which men ought to work. If you want to be healed, come on one of them. That's what they say. Can you believe the arrogance? Can you believe the audacity of these people who are supposed to be the ones who are conveying the truth of God? That they don't convey the grace of God, they convey this legalistic observation. See, that's kind of where we're at in American culture with our understanding of the Sabbath. We don't want to extend a helping hand to people in need. We don't want to reach out to people who are different than us. We don't want to stand arm in arm with people who we disagree with. We just want to do our own thing, and we're happy with that. Because we've been convinced that the way we live our lives is normal. Look, it's normal to be selfish. It's normal to be greedy. It's normal to be concerned about you. Don't worry about anybody else. God will take care of them. That's the normal way we live our lives, and that's not right. The principle of the Sabbath says everything you believe about how you interact with your neighbors, about how you interact in your community. The Sabbath principle says all that needs to change. And you need to know who your neighbors are. You need to do something about the epidemics. Everything's an epidemic nowadays. But you need to do something about the epidemics that exist in your community, because our communities are full of them. Look around at the drug problem in our area. Look around at the family problem. Look, in America, we've got a serious marriage and family problem, if you all haven't figured that out by now. But look at the problems we've got as it relates to the family. We've got to do something about that, not stand idly by. The principle of the Sabbath says get involved. Reach out to your neighbor. If he's needy, help out. And don't do it expecting something in return. Give generously, give liberally, give all that you've got, because who does it all come from anyways? It all comes from God. And I can hear somebody say, well, Brian, I'm just getting by week anyways. Because the reality is for a lot of people in our area, even if they have good jobs, they kind of see themselves as the people just getting by. And because of the way we live in our culture, that's really true. I mean, I think about the way my grandma lived. She didn't need high-speed internet in her house. Number one, because high-speed internet didn't exist when she was alive, but she wouldn't have needed it anyways. She didn't need, satellite TV. She didn't need streaming service. So much of the stuff we live with today, she didn't need. Matter of fact, she didn't even have a car when she got older. She didn't need any of that stuff. And yet she was able to live. And now we'd scratch our heads and say, how in the world could anyone do that? I mean, how can you get by if you can't binge watch something? How can you get by if you can't keep up on the latest news every minute of the day? How do we live like that? Well, we can. We just don't. And so that forces us to this point where we got to get all this stuff. And we've got to have all these things. And our kids have got to have all these things. And so when we get to the end of the week, we got nothing left. As a matter of fact, for a lot of people, not only do we have nothing left, in some cases, we borrowed to cover what we didn't need. And so we say, well, I'm just getting by. Well, you're not really just getting by. You're just making maybe bad life decisions in the way you spend your money. But we all think that we're just barely getting by. I'm living paycheck to paycheck, and I just don't have any excess to share. That's the attitude we have. And so maybe we would think, well, Brian, I do have a little extra money, but if I give it away, well, what about me? I mean, who's going to look out for my needs? Who's going to take care of me? And really, if you understand the Sabbath the right way, God will. He will provide for you. He will care for you. He will give you what you need, because that's what He said He would do. But the big hang-up really is an issue of trust, isn't it? I mean, who do I trust to pay my mortgage? I trust me. I don't figure anybody else is going to do it. Who do I trust to put food on my table? I trust me, because I don't figure anybody else is going to do it. Who do I trust to clothe me? I trust me because I've got great fashion sense. So I just trust me for stuff like that. So, look, we live in this culture where it's really an issue of trust. I'm not trusting God for my daily bread. I'm not trusting God for where I'm going to sleep. I'm not trusting God for what I'm going to put on. I trust in someone else. And it indicates the reality that we have a lack of faith in our lives. And so when it comes to helping out the people around me or getting involved in their lives, I'm not going to do it because I'm getting nothing out of it, and I'm not willing to invest what little I've got. And all of that screams loud and clear, no, I don't get the Sabbath. Because in the Sabbath, I'm willing to proclaim good news to the poor. I'm willing to set prisoners free. I'm willing to forgive debts. I'm willing to release the people around me from any obligations they may have. Think about that. I'm going into life not expecting anything from anybody. And I'm going to give everything that I can give. That is a trait that we don't see a lot of in our culture today. But the truth is, if you've experienced release, shouldn't you be willing to give release? Or, hold on, how about I say it another way? Maybe it'll make more sense. If you can't forgive people of their sin, can you be forgiven of sin? And the biblical answer is no, you cannot. If you're not willing to forgive the people around you, then how will your Heavenly Father forgive you? So if you have experienced being set free, because that's the word I'm going to transition to right now, because the NIV says Jesus came to set at liberty, or to set free those who had been prisoners. Do you understand that at one time we'd all been prisoners? We all had been locked up. We all had been in a prison that we were incapable of getting out of. But when Jesus came into our lives, we were set free from the prison of sin. We were set free from the bondage and the prison that had held us down. And we were released from all of our obligations. If that's true, shouldn't we then release those around us? Or at least do things that can help facilitate their release? Look, I don't know that we get the connection of how important the principles of the Sabbath are to our everyday lives. If we did, we probably wouldn't do a lot of the stuff we do now. We probably would live radically different than the way we live now, because we would care about so many of the issues that we don't think about or even want to care about. See, we don't get into a lot of social issue stuff down here in Pike County, primarily because of our mentality. I mean, we just don't see it as that big of a deal. So when it comes to stuff like, going above and beyond to clothe the naked, and I know we don't have people who are naked per se, but to give clothes to those in need. Unless someone says, hey, I'm doing this, we don't make a concerted effort to do that, do we? I mean, since we've stopped doing our food pantry, do we think a lot about how badly the poor need food? Probably not. Now look, Jesus, as he talks about Judgment Day, he does it a little differently than the way we would understand Judgment Day. Because look, the way we Protestants think of Judgment Day goes something like this. We get to heaven, we go before the throne of God, we're found guilty of all our sin, but then Jesus steps in and says, no, I've forgiven them, they can go to heaven. Isn't it kind of the way we think about it? That's kind of the way we think about it. Here's the way Jesus talked about it. Jesus said something like this. When I was hungry, you gave me what? Food. When I was thirsty, you gave me what? When I was in prison, you what? You visited me. So how crazy is this? That Jesus paints the picture that those who get to enter in to the joy of the Father have visited him in prison, giving him food when he was hungry, giving him a drink when he was thirsty. Now, how radically different is that than our understanding as Protestants? See, we think, I got this whole grace card, and I'm going to get to heaven someday, and God's going to say, hey, you're a sinner. And I'm going to say, oh, got the trump card right here. Here's my grace card. Get me into heaven free. Jesus apparently never got that concept, because Jesus says, you who have visited me in prison, you who have given me something to drink, you who have given me something to eat, you all can enter into the joy of my Father. You know what the other group is saying? Hold on. Wait a minute, that seems unfair. What about all this stuff we've talked about? What about all these good things? Jesus says, no, depart from me. I don't even know who you are. See, we as Protestants, we love this whole grace thing because we think it exempts us from dealing with the problems that exist in our everyday culture. It does not. So we need to stop playing our grace card and start playing our faith card. Because faith says, I'm going to do what God has equipped me to do, irregardless of what it costs me. And it may cost me a lot. And we've got to decide if that's the price we're willing to pay. And what I think we would find out if we looked really close is, that's a price we just don't want to pay right now. Because we are more comfortable living in the things of the world than we are experiencing the grace of God. If we've truly been released from our obligations, we should make sure everyone around us is released from theirs. Stand with me and bow your heads this morning. Father, again, we want to thank you for our time here together and for the truth and the power of your word, in particular for what is conveyed to us in our understanding of the Sabbath laws and the regulations that come not just from the Old Testament, from the New Testament as well. Because what you've given us in our Sabbath understanding is a way in which we could be released and in which we could offer release. First and foremost, you have released us from the debt of sin that we all owed. And even though we may have come to a point in our spiritual walks when we've forgotten how great that debt really was, the reality for everyone in here this morning is that when we came to you, we carried a debt of sin that we were never going to pay off by anything that we could ever do. But that's when we experienced the life-transforming grace of your Son, Jesus Christ, who set us free from the prison of sin and liberated us from its bondage so that we could live today as free men and women in the kingdom of God. And yet, Father, we're surrounded by people who are still living in that same bondage. And we rarely speak the good news of your Son, Jesus Christ, so they could experience what it means to truly be set free by your Son. So, Father, I ask this morning, first of all, that you would give us the boldness to speak the words of truth with confidence like they did in the early church. You would give us the boldness to speak what your word says so that the masses living around us that don't know you could experience the power and the forgiveness of your Son, Jesus Christ. And secondly, Father, as we look around at our culture, which right now seems to be falling apart at the seams, financially, we seem to be just devastated. Politically, we've got a government that is inept and is incapable of really doing anything to offer us any relief. And we see the riots and the protests that are really causing havoc in our big cities. Father, give us the motivation we need to not stand idly by and do nothing in the midst of a chaotic culture, but let us embrace the truths that are contained in your Sabbath so we can give food and water and love and kindness and clothes and whatever you call on us to give to those who have desperate needs in our world today. And let us brace the causes that we so often want to forget about with all the grace and mercy and peace and comfort that you could possibly give us. In Jesus' name I pray.